Hey everybody, Josh Sigurdson of World Alternative Media here, and of course I'm joined with John Sneisen. And without further ado, we are joined from Alberta, Canada, by Edward Goodliffe. Welcome to World Alternative Media, Edward.
Hello and good evening to you.
All right, well, can you tell our viewers a bit about your background, what brought you from Europe to Canada, and your involvement at the executive level of the Wildrose Party?
Right. I can tell you why I was inspired to leave Britain. Having grown up there and seen the ever-encroaching socialism of the Harold Wilson regime, when he made it very difficult for everybody, mainly by raising taxes to outrageous levels to finance the wildly socialist program that he had. At one point he had the income tax up to 95%, and I seem to remember once you got beyond £12,000 a year, your top bracket was 95%, and to work for 5% is absolutely preposterous, and I thought, right, it's time to leave. And so that was my inspiration to get out. So in many respects, I'm very pleased about Harold Wilson, because life has been a lot better in Alberta than it ever would have been in Britain. And so that was what inspired me. Now, what was the next thing you were asking?
Well, what was? Can you tell our viewers a bit about your involvement at the executive level of the Wildrose Party?
Oh, yes, indeed. Yes, many years ago, together with a few neighbours of mine, we were talking about how in Alberta the Progressive Conservative Party had become very far removed from the people that were electing them. They were off becoming very much more socialist by the week. They weren't conservative anymore, progressive maybe, but not conservative. And it seemed that no matter what we did, they were heading down the path of socialism. So we got together and decided that the only solution was to form a new party. And I was friends with Link Byfield, and he was the major driving force behind it. His family, the Byfields, ran Alberta Report for many years and put out a really good magazine that had a lot of common sense in it. And Link, as I say, was a major driving force behind getting a new party started. And I was at those early meetings before we even came up with the name Wildrose. And we did eventually get the party set up. And it was very difficult because the establishment have organised things in such a way that they don't want to upset the status quo. They have it as difficult as possible for anyone to start a new party. And it turned out that we were required to get a massive number of names, and I forget what other hoops we had to jump through, but it got to the point that it was so difficult that we ended up joining forces with what was called the Alliance Party, that had got going on a similar idea of trying to bring an alternative to the PCs. And anyway, we joined forces, and the Wildrose Party was registered and away. So that was the early days of the Wildrose Party, and then I've been involved ever since then. And of course, in the last election, we got enough members in to form the official opposition. So we have made some progress.
Absolutely. Well, we've all heard the infamous Beatles song Taxman, 1 for you, 19 for me. And what do you think led to the insane tax rate in Britain, and what are your views on taxation in general?
Well, it was typical of all socialists. I think it was Margaret Thatcher that said that the trouble with socialism is that eventually you run out of other people's money. And that is exactly what they did. Now, in those days, in my childhood, It was the days when the British Empire was disappearing. After World War II, the British Empire was dissolved quite rapidly, and it all fell apart, and there'd been massive expenses in World War II, and Britain was essentially broke. And the pound sterling, which used to be the reserve currency of the world, that collapsed and the dollar replaced it. And so Britain was in retreat on every side. And the deficits were enormous. There were huge debt, and socialism with all the unnecessary spending was making it even worse. And so Britain was in a catastrophic mess. And so it was essential that they raised more money, so they taxed everything. Everything was taxed. And in fact, you were talking about that Beatles song, and I rather like the line where it said, "If 5% should appear too small, be thankful I don't take it all." And of course, that's their attitude, and they were taxing everything. And it was absolutely preposterous. And as I say, it was quite a relief to get away from there. But of course, it wasn't many years went by, and the British electorate woke up to the fact that socialism just doesn't work. And that's when Margaret Thatcher was elected, and things did improve for quite a few years.
Yeah, I mean, as much as we all love the Beatles, the implications are quite horrible, considering that it ruined so many people's lives. The taxation rate was unbelievable, and as you mentioned that line there, it's like they're saying, well, be lucky you have the little bit of freedom that you have left. Be lucky that we don't just enslave you all entirely. And, we've seen that this is something that's starting to encroach on us more and more today as well. But I wanted to ask, because I was quite curious about this, because you are a true believer in freedom and liberty. Edward, why Canada? I mean, the United States actually has a constitution protecting natural rights, whether it's respected or not, while Canada has a corporate charter that basically only allows rights when convenient for the government, with Canada's Bill of Rights, long forgotten. So why was it that you came to Canada, you chose Canada over the United States?
Right, now, bear in mind that 2/3 of everything you've said in the last 2 or 3 minutes I didn't hear. For some reason the sound cut out, but it sounded like, if I were to see what you said, what I did catch was, why did I go to Canada rather than the US? Is that right?
Yeah, I could quickly repeat the question.
Well, you don't need to, because if that's the question, I can answer it quite simply.
Yeah.
The US has a lot of wonderful things about it. But one thing the US has that only the Philippines also has, I think those are the only 2 countries in the world that have this system, which is one reason why nobody should ever go to the US. And that is, they tax you on citizenship. You can go to the US and become a citizen, and they will tax you on citizenship. So if you decide to leave and go to New Zealand, for example, or Chile or Argentina, and take up residence, you have to file and pay US taxes for the rest of your life. So you are owned by the US corporation. And that reason on its own is good enough to say, don't bother to go to the USA.
Yes, the reason that I ask Edward is, well, of course, the tax code in the United States is over 72,000 pages long. It's unbelievable. And I ask mostly because at least the United States has a constitution that backs up natural rights. And of course, it's broken with the taxation system that is in place. But Canada has a charter that basically only allows you natural rights instead of protecting them, which is a far cry from what the Constitution in the United States protects. Because of course we have Trudeau Sr., who basically incorporated Canada and made us all corporate entities, apart from sovereign individuals. So I think there is a massive difference between the ability of the individual to have their natural sovereign rights, even if it's completely infringed upon in the United States, versus Canada, which doesn't even allow for such a thing.
Right. Well, and of course that is true. And when you look at what Pierre Trudeau did with his repatriation of the Constitution, the whole thing was terrible when you think about it, because the so-called Charter of Rights and Freedoms basically replaced English common law, which gave us loads of rights that had been accumulated over the years since Magna Carta. And when they changed that with this so-called Charter of Rights and Freedoms, we, in actual fact, lost out. We don't even have property rights, and as you know, as the years have gone by, we've lost the freedom of speech. We no longer have that, and there are a lot of freedoms that have gone. Freedom was reduced immensely by Pierre Trudeau, and it's unfortunate. But the fact is, I suppose there is nowhere on earth that is perfect. Yeah. And for all its faults, Canada is a wonderful place and has been a wonderful place to be. It just grieves me greatly, though, to watch our freedoms eroded away, which is what they are, which is what is happening all the time. We are losing freedoms all the time.
Yes, and you talk about freedoms being eroded away. Now, this is something that you must be feeling astronomically right now in Alberta, because I wanted to know, what are your thoughts on the current socialist overtaking of Alberta and what it'll do to Canada as a whole in the long run?
Well, it's a terrible setback, and it's fairly plain to see why it happened, and this is most unfortunate because for many, many years we have had the progressive Conservatives. Now, when Lougheed first came in and replaced social credit, I can see that in those early years he did some good things and Alberta prospered. But as time went by, the progressive Conservatives became more progressive, and they also became more and more corrupt. And I can see why people wanted to vote them out, because I also wanted to vote them out. And I think the reason we ended up with an NDP government was Danielle Smith made that terrible mistake of crossing the floor a few months before the election, and all credibility of the Wildrose was damaged. And so a lot of the electorate voted NDP without really thinking through the consequences of inviting in a wildly socialist party. And now we're going to pay the price, and it's going to be a very high price, because socialism, wherever it is introduced, reduces the freedom of the individual and reduces the living standards. It's happened everywhere. Socialism destroys wealth, destroys individual liberty, and that's exactly what's going to happen to us and is happening, and we're stuck with it.
Absolutely. We see the problem, reaction, solution, the Hegelian dialectic, if you will. And it's really sad to see that people are always looking for a new slave master to take control over them, instead of looking to themselves as an individual to be the change they wish to see. And they always think that if they have a good idea, they're going to force other people to have that idea too. But good ideas don't need coercion, don't need to be forced on people. And I wanted to ask, because I know you've had a lot of interesting experiences at the Wildrose Party. How have you defended the Wildrose Party from collectivist influences? It's hard not to be infiltrated as a political party if you even have an inkling of a good idea.
Well, yes, that's right. In fact, everything you've just said, I agree with wholeheartedly. There is no need to force people to do anything, and individual freedom is what is important. And in the Wildrose Party, just like any other party, we have the potential of losing control of the philosophy. You see, anyone can join the party, anyone can get involved, and if people do not keep the purity of the message alive, socialism can creep in. And in our experience, or in my experience, at our local constituency level, a year and a bit ago, at our annual general meeting of the local constituency, we had only one possible candidate for the upcoming election, and he got up and spoke at the annual general meeting, and I was exceedingly disappointed to hear him talk, because he spoke like a socialist, and I thought, well, this is unfortunate that we, in a party that stands for individualism, is likely to have a candidate that thinks along collectivist lines. And so I, together with one other person, actively tried to find another candidate, and did find another possible candidate, and then managed to force a runoff meeting, and got enough people to support our man, who is an individualist, who replaced that other fellow. And when the election came along, we managed to get him elected. And so what this shows to me, and to anyone that might be listening to this, is that it is essential to get involved in your local political party, because if you don't influence it, it might just go the wrong way. And in fact, as Edmund Burke said many, many years ago, all that is necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing. And that is so true today, just like it was all that time ago.
And I think the voting process, to a large extent these days, is a great example of people doing nothing, because they're sitting there and they will vote for, say, the Conservatives if they're conservative, despite the fact that the Conservative Party isn't actually conservative by principle. They surely do not shrink the size of government. They surely do want to force people to do things. They surely want to have a say in people's everyday lives, and they don't have a right to do that, because we as individuals never did consent to that. If it were voluntary, I understand why some people would want to, for example, voluntarily pay for certain programs. But the fact is, we have no option to opt out, and we are forced into this kind of collectivism. And it's just people, when they sit there and they vote, they are just waiting for some leader to do something for them. And it's not going to change anything. Nothing ever changes, because for decade after decade after decade, we never learn. We vote for a new party, then we get that new party. We don't like them because they do something criminal. So then we vote for another one, and then we're stuck in this paradigm. And what I find interesting is that you have a party that is outside of that paradigm. And I wanted to know what your advice would be to John here, as John is one of the founders of the Manitoba Party, which follows a lot of the same examples as you do.
Right. Now, I hope you can hear me better than I can hear you, because again, it was fading out. And you wanted me to comment on John's Manitoba Party, but just before I do that, I want to just talk about something that you were talking about, the size of government.
Sure.
and how people vote, and there is no change. Now, if you look at the political system, you will see that built into it is this tendency to grow bigger and more powerful all the time. And it's something I've noticed since I've lived in Alberta, which has been over 40 years now. When I first came here, government was relatively small. And what has happened in those 40 years, as government has just continued to get bigger and bigger, and the Conservatives talked a good story about limited government, but they didn't limit it at all. It just kept getting bigger. Mm-hmm. And it's a bit like setting out on a journey. If you set out on a journey to sail across from Ireland to North America, and you just keep sailing in the same direction, it doesn't matter how slowly you go, eventually you will get to North America. Well, if we set out on a course of ever-increasing government and we never deviate from that course, eventually we will end up with total government where nobody has any say in anything and the government is everything. And that is the direction we're heading. And nothing has changed for many, many years. And we have to shrink the size of government if the individuals are to have anything left that resembles freedom. And of course, John and his Manitoba Party, I know the Manitoba Party is trying to stand up for individual rights, and that is exactly what we're doing with the Wildrose. And those individual rights, every time government gets more powerful, the individual gets less powerful. So we have to turn back government. We have to shrink the size of it. There is no alternative, because if we continue on the present course, we will all end up as total slaves to a behemoth of a government, a massive, monstrous machine.
Yeah, absolutely. And what I was trying to make mention of there was that you operate outside of the paradigm that we see today of the same parties over and over and over again. And I do remember at the launch of the Manitoba Party, the speech that one of the founders made was, we should be looking at the Wildrose Party and see what they're doing and be like the Wildrose Party and try and get that footing that you have gotten out there. And we know of the good work that you have done out there because we hear about it all the time, and people ask, why don't we have that? Why don't we have that here in Manitoba? And I think that's a credit to the excellent work you've done, Mr. Goodliffe. So, John, you had a question that you wanted to ask.
Yeah, first of all, I wanted to ask you a little bit about, because I've seen certain things happening to our political party. And what what you had when I met you down at Freedom Force in December in 2014 at the first Freedom Force Congress, you actually had a very interesting story to tell about when you ran for office. Do you want to just quickly run over a couple of things that happened when you were campaigning, just to give people an idea of what could happen when they run for office?
Oh, well, many years ago, when I first came here from Britain, I set up a nail manufacturing plant in southern Alberta in a little town called Granham. And I manufactured hundreds of tons of nails between the size of 2-inch and 12-inch in length. And what I learned during the decade or so that I was doing that was that the politicians would continually talk about how they were standing up for small business. We're going to help small business. And nothing could have been further from the truth. I found that everything was set up to make it as difficult as possible for small independent business, and everything was made to be as easy as possible for the massive multinational giants. And that they were basically, the government was in the pocket of the giant corporations. And what I saw was that not only that, I've discovered that Canada was set up for the benefit of Ontario and Quebec, and basically the other provinces were treated like colonies, especially in the West. And I say this because I experienced this firsthand. For example, when I sold a box of nails in Toronto, I had to ship that box of nails down to Toronto, and it would cost me $5 a box to ship it down there if I shipped it in large quantities, 20-ton loads, and it would cost me $5 a box in freight. Now, Sidbeck Dosco out of Quebec or Stelco out of Ontario, who were manufacturing nails as well, could ship their nails to Alberta, and it cost them $1. So it was costing me $5 to ship east, and they could ship west for $1. And the Canadian taxpayer was picking up $4 freight, because the way the country is set up, they do not want manufacturing anywhere other than Ontario and Quebec. And this is the way the country operates. I also found that despite them saying that they were supporting small business, when it came to federal sales tax, which is what was around before the GST, we had to charge 7% GST on our selling price, which was $24 a box, and Stelco and Sigurdson and all the big boys, they had a special deal with the tax department. Revenue Canada allowed them to charge it on an agreed price of $10 a box. But being just a small manufacturer, I wasn't allowed to do that. I had to charge it on the selling price. So I paid 2.4 times as much tax. Now that isn't looking after small business. So that inspired me to run in the 1988 election that John was talking about. And I ran as a Western separatist because I was so disgusted with the way Alberta was being treated. The more I looked at it, the more I realized that we were being totally ripped off by Confederation. And in actual fact, at that time, it worked out for a family of 4 with the transfer payments going down east. We could afford to give every family of 4 a free house in 10 years by not sending transfer payments down to Ottawa. So during that election campaign, when I was one of 7 candidates, I did manage to get people quite excited when I was telling them these facts that most people hadn't bothered to look into because we were being treated so very badly. And as the years have gone by, effectively nothing has changed. And in fact, right now, Alberta is still paying the full transfer payments, even though Alberta is in the doldrums. We have an oil price that has collapsed. The income to the provincial government is way down, and yet we're having to borrow money to send it down east so that Quebec can live high on the hog on Alberta borrowed money, which is a pretty sad reflection of our confederation.
Absolutely, and I mean, what do you think of this push by actually Kevin O'Leary to, I believe, pay your premier to step down? What do you think about that?
Well, it would be nice if she would step down, but I think it's somewhat unlikely, is that she got her mandate at the election there, and she's firmly entrenched, really, until she decides to call another election.
Well, I have to say that I'm actually quite impressed by her not stepping down. I can't stand her, for one. I have to make that point clear, but I'm surprised that she didn't step down because the NDP usually doesn't turn down, taking money on the side, if you know what I mean. But John, you had something else you wanted to ask here.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you, and you've been here for way longer than me, and you've seen the decline of the Canadian dollar. Now, I wanted to see what your thoughts were about where the Canadian dollar is heading in the next, let's say, 2 to about 10 years or so, and what you think is going to happen to the economy.
Well, we seem to have ended up being a nation of hewers of wood and drawers of water. I mean, we are just resource-based. All our manufacturing has been exported to China. All these international trade deals where they call it free trade is not free at all, and is exceedingly managed for the benefit of large corporations. And what has happened is our manufacturing has been outsourced to China and India and you name it, anywhere where there's cheap labour, which has made us resource-based. And of course, Alberta and Saskatchewan, with the tremendous oil production here, this is a major export for our country, and when oil is depressed, our dollar goes down the toilet, and that is exactly what has happened. I mean, if you think about it, when oil was up at over $100 a barrel, our dollar was trading at parity with the US dollar, and now we're having to pay nearly 40% premium to buy a US dollar, and that is purely because the commodities are down in value, and so therefore our currency has gone down the drain, just like Australia's has, because they too are a resource-based economy. So I think that now that our manufacturing has been outsourced and we are left just with raw materials, we are totally dependent on commodity prices. So while commodity prices are low, our dollar is going to be very low in value, and should commodity prices go high, then we can expect our dollar to go higher with it.
Yeah, and of course Canada just sold off almost all of its gold, so it's almost like it's almost like they're doing this on purpose, like they're trying to purposely crash the economy. It's unbelievable. They're either really stupid or they're just plain evil.
They are not stupid. Everything that happens is planned to happen that way. And you have to bear in mind that the globalists are hell-bent, determined to have their one world government, and the nation-states are getting in the way of that, and they are going to destroy the nation-states so that they can have their one world government, which reminds me of a trip to Zimbabwe back in the 1990s, when I went there with an Australian gold prospector, and I was very interested to visit that country because it used to be Southern Rhodesia, a place where I really admired the Ian Smith regime, which was the last white government of Southern Rhodesia. And when I went there in about, in fact, I think it was the late 80s even, maybe it was early 90s. But anyway, Mugabe and his communist government was in charge at that time, and just before going there I had read Ian Smith's book, The Great Betrayal, and in that book he talked about how Britain and America were the instigators and promoters of communism. And I found this kind of difficult to believe, because I'd always imagined that Britain and the United States had been the bastion fighting against communism. And so I was kind of incensed with what he said. And while I was there, I managed to find out where Ian Smith lived, and after a lot of trouble I did find out exactly where he lived, and went and banged on his door, and to my absolute delight he answered the door. And I said to him that I had come all the way from Canada, and I'd read his book, and I had admired him for many years, and wanted to talk to him about some of the things he'd said in his book. And he said, well, by all means, come on in. And I sat in his living room for maybe an hour or so and talked about it. And during that conversation, he convinced me in no uncertain terms that what he had said about Britain and the US being the instigators and promoters of communism was absolutely right. And I went home and I did a lot of research. I bought a bunch of books, probably the most influential by Anthony Sutton, where he described, one of his books was called Wall Street and the Russian Revolution. And you see quite clearly how it was all New York bankers and London bankers who set up the Russian Revolution, financed it, carried it out. For China was deliberately put in by the big bankers. They were taken communist by the big bankers. People think that communism is the people rising up against the capitalists, the capitalist bankers, when nothing could be further from the truth. No. It is the big banking interests setting it up, pretending to look after the people when really they are enslaving the people.
Yeah, absolutely. And we actually had an excellent conversation with Gary Arnold recently regarding what you're talking about, and he brought up Anthony Sutton, and you perfectly led into my next question, actually, which was about your thoughts on the push for international collectivism, or a new world order, if you will, because it's so delusional for people to continuously call New World Order conspiracy theory. It's the most openly obvious thing that we see implemented by governments around the world to this day. And it is this kind of deception that communism somehow is the anti-establishment way, when it's forced collectivism of every individual. And we are watching the Communist Manifesto play out perfectly worldwide. So what do you think the long-term implications of a new world order are, and where are we seeing it happen in society today?
Well, the long-term implications of it is, if we do not wake up the masses, and we allow people to remain asleep and remain ignorant, and this thrust for one world government continues, we will end up as total peasants in a tyrannical, communist, one world government where nobody has any input at all. It will be a life of absolute tyranny. And the thing is, when you look at it, we are many and they are few. Mm-hmm. The ones who wish to enslave us all are very few in number. The people that want to be free are very voluminous in number, but they are all asleep at the wheel. And we have to wake them up. And should we be fortunate enough to actually wake them up, we can turn all this around. Because people do not want to live in servitude. They want to live happy, rewarding lives. And the only way they can do that is if we look after individual freedoms, and we have to turn back to collectivism. And if we wake people up to this, we can completely turn the world around. And if we fail to do this, the future is grim.
Absolutely. And you bring us to solutions here, and that's something that we need to talk about, because of course we see people coming out against capitalism, despite the fact that true capitalism doesn't and can't exist in the kind of coercive society that we live in today. And I wanted to bring up a solution that you are part of, which is, can you tell our viewers a bit about your involvement with Freedom Force International and the amazing G. Edward Griffin? John and I are both proudly members. In fact, John's on the council with you, of course. The two lone Canadians, and interestingly enough, both born in different countries. But can you tell us a bit about the excellent work that you guys do at Freedom Force International and what your long-term goal is?
Well, do you know what? For many, many years, I never realized I was an individualist. It was only after reading the words of Mr. G. Edward Griffin that I woke up to the fact that I was an individualist. I didn't realize. I mean, if people had asked me what my view on life was, I would say that I would have supported free enterprise, and I didn't like government coercion, but I never realized that I was an individualist until I read what he had written. Now, Mr. Griffin is an extraordinary man. What he is a really, really talented fellow for doing is he can take a very complicated subject, cut through all the nonsense, and get to the absolute meat. And analyze it precisely. And he is so good at doing that, whether his book about the United Nations, which was called The Fearful Master, which was absolutely brilliant and gives you a completely clear understanding of the United Nations and just how evil it is, and The Creature from Jekyll Island, where he took the money system, fractional reserve banking, and showed how that is the root of most evil in this world. And so the involvement with Freedom Force was when I realized what he was saying was so true. I was greatly inspired by it. And so I joined Freedom Force, and I firmly believe that although the task is so daunting as to be almost impossible, we must try and implement what he is aiming to do, because if we can wake up the masses to the fact that individualism is the way to promote freedom throughout the world, if we could just wake people up to this message, we really can turn things around. And so that's why I'm involved with Freedom Force, and that's why I get quite excited about it, because I see it as identifying the real problem and offering a solution, albeit a rather a difficult solution to attain, but it is nevertheless a solution.
Yeah, and you can't achieve anything without trying. And J. Edward Griffin is such a brilliant, brilliant man. And I believe that the second that we give up is the second that every bit of work that J. Edward Griffin and everyone else that have tried to do similar things have done, that's when everything they've done will be meaningless. The second that we give up is the second that everything everyone has tried to do in the past as a solution will be worth nothing. And no matter how hard a task, it is up to us to be able to make sure that we maintain in every way possible our individual liberties and our freedoms, and to be able to make our own decisions, to be able to opt out of what we don't believe in morally or in any way. It's up to us. And I think that you are someone that is doing incredible work, Mr. Goodliffe, and I'm honored to speak with you. Where can people find more of your work and support the work that you do?
Well, I missed the last bit of what you said
where can people find more of your work and support the work that you do?
Oh my goodness, I don't really know how to answer that because I don't know where they could find it. They could find it by contacting me. I mean, I write letters to the paper and stuff like this, but really, I don't have any organisation that I'm actively involved with, other than Freedom Force, and also the Wildrose Party I'm active with. But
so how can people help what you're doing at the Wildrose Party and with Freedom Force?
Oh well, in both those instances, if they want to be involved with Freedom Force, they need to check out the Freedom Force website, have a good look at it, and I think they will be amazed at the good sense that they will read. I mean, it's such common sense and such a good idea to promote individualism, to promote freedom for everybody. And when it comes to provincial politics, to look at the Wildrose Party, you can see that it is the only party that really has a chance of implementing an individualist society in Alberta. It's the only one that stands up for individual liberty, and that's what we need, because we are surrounded by this suffocating socialism that is destroying everything. And the thing is, the alternative to socialism has been crony capitalism. I wanted to get this in earlier on when you were talking, because the capitalist system is wonderful. The free market is wonderful. If you read The Wealth of Nations, that old book from way back, Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations. If you read that and you see how free enterprise works for generating wealth for everybody, it works so well. But what we have is not free enterprise. We have crony capitalism.
Yeah, everyone that's
allowed the big boys to have an unfair advantage against everyone else. And I use as an example of this, take the tar sands of Alberta. If you and I wanted to go and extract some of the tar sand and produce petroleum spirit from it, the Alberta government would tell us to get stuffed. We could not do it. We would not be allowed to extract that tar sands. Whereas if we were a massive corporation or a massive government entity from China, they would roll out the red carpet to allow us to exploit that resource. That's because we have crony capitalism and it stinks.
Yeah, and I would even add to that, because as you mentioned, it's crony capitalism, and what we see today, all these people that are complaining about capitalism don't realize that what we're seeing is quite the opposite. We're seeing corporatism, corporate fascism, if anything. I mean, I would even say that I wouldn't even call it crony capitalism, because it's almost like calling it crony decency. It's insanity.
What it is, Josh and Edward, it's socialism for the rich.
Absolutely.
That's basically what it is.
Absolutely, and I think too many people are too thrown off by the idea that, you know, free enterprise isn't what they think it is. The big multinationals that we see today were propped up largely due to big government monopolization. We see
exactly right. That's exactly right. And Benito Mussolini said that fascism was correctly called corporate fascism.
Mm-hmm.
It was a marriage of big corporations and the state.
Yeah, the only place you see today where there's actual true capitalism by its very standards is a place like a garage sale or a lemonade stand, and they're trying to ban that now. I mean, it's absolutely unbelievable, and the communists think that the establishment's against them? Give me a break. This is an insane attack on the freedom and liberty of every single individual and their ability to do commerce, to simply trade something for the price that they want, and the other party taking that at that price and accepting and consenting. It's as easy as consent and, you know, your own ability to trade. It's one of the biggest basics of life and trade, and they've taken it away from us. We don't have...
Absolutely. And, you know, another point I must get in here, which is slightly different to what you're talking about, but, you know, people's understanding of forms of government is so out of whack. People think that you have communism at one end of the spectrum and fascism at the other end of the spectrum, and they don't realize that both fascism and communism are identical. They are so close that there is almost no difference. In fact, in the early days of National Socialism in Germany, the Nazi Party admitted that there was effectively no difference between their policies and the communists.
No.
And so therefore, people get confused over it when there's only two forms of government, and one is individualism and the other is collectivism.
Yeah,
and basically in Canada, every party is collectivist to some degree or another.
Yeah, I think of it as a giant circle, and you know, individualism is on the outside of that circle.
Precisely, it's a giant circle, you're right.
So, John, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, Edward, from my studies of, like, I come from the same kind of point of view as you did in England, where I was a part of a huge collectivist and socialist country called Norway. And what I've seen is, over time, the just increase of government, as you're saying, and it's just an accumulation because people in the government, they have a job in the government and they want job security. Now, in order to keep that, they want maybe to hire some more people, and they slowly grow, and it accumulates on itself. And I looked at some numbers, and when we started the Manitoba Party, I talked about this. It was the government expenditure as a part of the GDP of a country. Now, when you looked at the top tiers there, the ones that really had the highest is the ones that are in despair, like Greece, like Spain, like Portugal, like Finland, and Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. These countries have really huge economic struggles right now because they've had socialism for a very long time, and we're seeing where Canada is heading right now. It is to this socialist empire where government is becoming so big that now it's over 50% of the size of the GDP in Norway. If you strip away the oil, and same with Canada will probably lie around almost 60%, while Norway is about 68% size of government. And now we're talking about an unsustainable government. Where are you going to get the taxes from on paying that 68% of people that works as a part of the government? How are you going to be able to sustain that when only 42% of people doing productive activities, having a job, having a small and medium-sized business like you've had and currently have? How are they going to, be able to sustain that? I think it's going to collapse in on itself. And the thing is, when it collapses, we need to educate people, as you said. We need to talk to them and make them understand the difference between individualism, which they don't even know about, and collectivism. And as we do that, I do believe that we could change this, because if we don't, we're going to end up on the hardcore right side of collectivism, either with massive amounts of corporate fascism or just straight out communism.
Absolutely.
Well, do you know what? You're so right. You're so right. But I go back to what I said earlier in this conversation about setting course from Ireland and heading for North America. If you never deviate from that course, no matter how slowly the ship sails, eventually you will get to North America. And with all these governments, they have set out on the course of collectivism and ever-enlarging government, and they have never deviated from that course in 100 or more years. And every year government gets bigger and more encompassing, and it continues and continues, and there is only one way it can end up, and that is with total government, where everybody will have to give all of their income to government and have it spent on their behalf. And as you can see, and anyone can see, that day will never happen, because at some point, when people's tax gets so high that they will get to the point where they will refuse to work, because what is the point in working? So then the whole system collapses. Mm-hmm. And it has to collapse. And there is no way of stopping it collapsing, because people are too stupid to stop ever expanding government. And so unless we wake everyone up to what's the inevitable, it's going to collapse, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's been brilliant talking with you, Edward. I want the viewers to please check out Edward Goodliffe's work on YouTube. Actually, I've seen some good conversations that you've had on Anthony Hilder's YouTube account. And I also want people to, in Alberta, because we have a lot of incredible viewers in Alberta, please check out the Wildrose Party. Please do everything you can. If you believe in freedom, you have no excuse sitting on your couch and doing nothing. The only way that things are going to get done is if you stand up and you do something. It's the only way. You cannot wait for someone else to do it for you. And I thank Edward so much for talking with us. On the other hand, if you guys have any questions for us here at WHAM, please send them in. If you've got hate mail, please send it in. We do enjoy a good laugh. And we will be talking with you soon. Stay tuned for lots more at World Alternative Media. This is Josh Sigurdson with John Sneisen and Edward Goodliffe signing out.